sort of the such. But what was particularly troublesome was one crypto trading platform called FTX. And their founder, Sam Bankman-Fried, or SBF, as he's now known, and some of the statements, things that were happening in that particular trading platform that really catapulted the rest of the ecosystem into sort of this spiral of chaos. So I'm going to review some of the workings from the House Committee on Financial Services when they started investigating what happened with FTX. So FTX was a global cryptocurrency trading platform founded by their CEO, Sam Bankman-Fried, and the former Chief Technology Officer, Gary Wang, in 2019. So not very long in terms of their run and business. And they allowed users of their exchange to buy, sell, and hold and lend cryptocurrencies, as well as trade on margin derivatives in crypto. At its peak, it was the third largest crypto exchange in terms of daily trading volume, behind Binance and Coinbase. So you've got like the three biggest players, and FTX being third on that list. The main FTX exchange is valued about $32 billion, with recent funding rounds in January and fall of 2022. They were headquartered in the Bahamas. So for the legal folks in the room, that's problematic. Outside of the jurisdiction of the US laws really could only get to people in the US, right? Just think of it that way. They're headquartered in the Bahamas and then previously headquartered in Hong Kong, another logistic nightmare. And then they engage customers across the US through their FTX US sort of subsidiary. And then they also collected lots of, famous people who had invested the money in them, some of them you may have heard of, like Tom Brady, Steph Curry. They're kind of all athletes. Well, I guess they have more disposable income than the rest of us. And Kim Kardashian, that's true. So in October, around October, November, is that about right, Tiffany? Sam Bankman-Fried was realizing they were hitting a liquidity crunch at FTX and reached out to the founder, owner of Binance to try to get some support in terms of maybe either getting a loan, I think was initially, and then they sort of changed their mind into a potential merger between the two exchanges. And luckily, Binance either had some wherewithal or some smart lawyers or both. And they started kicking the tires and asking for some documentation and wanting to understand how the company was valued, and realized the valuation was based on a coin that FTX created called FTT. And at that point, they decided not to pursue further talks on an M&A. And quickly thereafter, FTX hit their sort of liquidity cliff, and so that they were halting all trading, freezing all accounts, and then shortly thereafter, it collapsed into a full-on bankruptcy filing. I don't have a bankruptcy expert here today. That was one expert I was hoping to get. But from what I remember from bankruptcy in law school, I'll put it that way. When you file for bankruptcy as a corporate entity, it is like your sort of shield against everything. It stops the clock on debts might be owed to creditors and others. It sort of gives you a time to like reorganize and refocus on what's going on with your financial holdings and accounts. And then you negotiate with the trustee on who you will pay back, what debts you will write off, and how you will kind of continue on as a going concern. So bankruptcy is usually like a safe haven for companies if they're having financial issues. And so it was definitely a smart move on their part to do that. But as a result of that, it definitely brought a spotlight to the company. And we had the hearings that followed with the sort of CEO that was put in place and all of the other things that have kind of rippled out in terms of the crypto system. All right, are we back with Nelson? Good. Nelson, if you have a chance to hop on, we'd love to get you involved in the conversation. Yay! I told you he was. We just went through, did you hear my remarks about like, sort of how did we get here?
Yes, I did.
Um,
Can you not hear me? Uh-oh. Oh dear.
we're just gonna try to.
Let me try this. Can you hear me now? No?
Okay.
How about now?
Well, while we're working on that, Tiffany, tell us your thoughts in terms of from the business side, like from what you're advising with your clients and where we are today and how we got here. Were there sort of like the Titanic, were there cracks in the ship that people ignored? Or just what are your thoughts?
So thanks again for the invitation. Glad to be here. Is my mic still working? Feels like, okay, perfect. So I have lots of thoughts, but in the interest of brevity, I think one of the main things I want to point out is that so there's things that happened prior to FTX, like the Terra Luna collapse, all of the volatility in the crypto market. FTX is, and there's like a host of issues associated with those collapses, those bankruptcies. I would differentiate FTX from those situations because at this point, we understand, as is alleged by various criminal regulators, that there was some fraud occurring, right? And so there's, I think, one, we've definitely highlighted that there needs to be better risk practices with respect to crypto. It's a very nascent market, but like there's also fraud, which allegedly has resulted and perpetuated the FTX collapse, right? So, and I think folks who are in the crypto industry are trying to disentangle what happened at FTX that was related to the alleged fraud that occurred there. You can't steal money from clients. You can't use client assets to make investments versus like risk management, which is an issue that broadly occurred within the crypto industry, because again, it's a nascent market when you don't have the same regulations and protections as TradFi. The other thing that I'll just point out, because it's worth noting here, is that in the bankruptcy, again, because it's a nascent market, in a traditional financial services market, when an intermediary is holding client assets, there are protections, there are laws in place so that those client assets are not part of the bankruptcy estate, right? And so in the securities markets, you have insurance, you have called SIPA, you have very strict regulations about holding customer assets separate and apart from proprietary assets. Again, that didn't exist with respect to the crypto market, one, because we don't really have the regulations for the most part, footnote that because New York does. But like that's one of the big takeaways from this. There's a focus now on how customer assets are being maintained by crypto firms. And there's a widespread practice from a security perspective because all assets in crypto are held on the blockchain, which is like viewable by everyone that understands who owns the wallet. So from a really security perspective, the practice of having omnibus accounts where you have both proprietary and client assets together was developed. And now, and people, there wasn't a focus on that before. And now with that built with the bankruptcy laws and the protections not being in place has resulted in a lot of clients losing access to their assets, which has really put focus on that practice and really called for there to be additional rules around that so that clients are protected in the event of bankruptcy.
All right, St. Nelson, this is a good time to segue to you to help us explain some of the nuances on blockchain and what that structure as far as like the putting things on chain, off chain, or having that visibility can either help or hurt. But just give us a little bit of a primer and then we can get into more of the weeds on blockchain and crypto.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yay, you can. All right,
Yes.
excellent. Well, this is
On the
good.
Powerball for IT
These,
right now.
these are not so much technical difficulties as I should just be in Atlanta right now difficulties. So
You know what?
apologies.
I was gonna say that, but I don't want to put you on the spot.
Well, let's not tell my sister-in-law who lives outside the city that I'm not there because she would be upset. So I'm happy to be here with all of you today. Nicole, I don't know how much background, if any, you gave on me. So let me just share my screen. You guys should see a PDF. Is that correct?
Yep, we can see it.
Good. I'm glad I didn't dox all my client stuff. Just kidding, of course. All right, so let's go full screen here. All right, so I'm Nelson Rosario. I'm the founder of Rosario Tech Law, a boutique firm based here in Chicago, Illinois. I have been practicing crypto law in one capacity or another since 2016, early 2016. I first got interested in Bitcoin in 2012. I, of course, didn't buy a bunch because I'm not retired. But my background is in computer science, hence my interest in this. I primarily function as outside general counsel to crypto companies, as well as a couple of AI companies, as well as an intellectual property kind of specialist. I'm a registered patent attorney. So I see a lot of innovation and a lot of kind of crazy stuff that people are doing. But I agree, Nicole, this is a good segue for kind of these slides I put together today of a primer on blockchain technology, because what happened with FTX really had nothing to do with blockchain technology. And so I think it's important to focus on, what is actually new here? Okay, why do we care? What's innovative? And you can't do that without looking at what is blockchain, right? Is it the future, a scam, just magic internet money? Well, it's kind of a little bit of all of those things, right? But it's mainly about one key principle, and that's trust. I'm an adjunct law professor. I've been at Chicago Kent College of Law here, where I've been teaching a class called Blockchain, Cryptocurrency, and the Law since January of 2018. And we always impress upon our students that this is a coordination technology that allows people to engage in transactions and manage trust in a way that they weren't able to do before. And the kind of principal innovation here is that you're able to engage in these transactions without the use of a central counterparty, right? So there was a mention of, the TradFi, traditional financial markets. All of the interactions there are mediated by financial players, the big kind of mega institutions that we're all familiar with, Chase, the New York Stock Exchange, places like that, Robinhood, if anybody does some zero fee day trading. So what's different here is now that we have information on a network that we don't necessarily trust, but we can trust that the information hasn't been tampered with. So how is that possible? Well, even though it's 2023 and we're talking about FTX and there's all sorts of interesting things going on with smart contracts, NFTs, privacy tech related to this, it really does all begin with Bitcoin. And it's important to kind of ground your thinking in what was new and what was enabled by Bitcoin. So Bitcoin was originally developed largely in part as a solution to what's known as a double spending problem. So the double spending problem is if you have some electronic money, in this case Bitcoin, and you want to send it to person A or to person B, how does person A know that you have not already sent it to person B, right? How do they know you haven't already spent the money that they claim they're sending it to? So how does Bitcoin do this? Well, it uses a public ledger of all transactions. It uses some cryptography, and it uses something called mining. This slide here is a kind of prehistory of all the technological advances that led up to Bitcoin when the white paper was published in October 31st of 2008. And you see it goes all the way back to 1974 and the protocol for TCP IP, which basically enabled the internet as we know it today, how information would be handled, as well as a lot of key innovations on the path to Bitcoin and having basically the equivalent of digital cash. And by that, I mean something of value that's kind of a bearer asset that doesn't have a bank in the middle. It doesn't have a mint. There's no central counterparty. This is just a graphic showing, mechanically how transactions work on almost every blockchain network, where you have owners signing transactions with private keys. That information goes into kind of a data payload related to the transaction, and it gets built into subsequent transactions that build upon it. And all of these things are built into blocks of transactions, which is where we get the name blockchain, right? There's a lot more to it. And when you're actually teaching kind of like a full law school class on this, we spend about a month and a half on the tech behind here. So what's important though, for our purposes, is the result. We have this unique digital property that's secured without the need of a third party. The transactions on the network are public to everyone in the network. And so anyone can verify that funds on the network haven't been spent yet, okay? Put it another way, now we have true digital scarcity, and everything since Bitcoin builds upon these concepts. Ethereum really took it to the next level, you could say, with kind of a robust smart contract framework that allowed for computer instructions and programmability and certain functionality to be deployed on chain to enable new types of interactions that were more content and feature rich. But everything starts from Bitcoin. And again, it's that idea of trust, right? Censorship resistant value transfer. There's no counterparty in the middle. And it's, composed of building blocks that we understand: networks, peer-to-peer, ledgers, they're distributed, they're public, and then some cryptography to kind of ensure that, we can verify who's sending information. And that's what builds out blockchain applications. You add in some economic incentives around consensus and why people would want to even maintain these networks, and you get really interesting, innovative stuff. But again, all of that doesn't really have anything to do with FTX, but it is the kind of plumbing that generates all this interest in what is now basically $1 trillion market. So, this is kind of a short, quick, and dirty of how we got from here to here. There may be a couple of intermediary steps, but that is more or less the intro I have for you to kind of try and ground us.
That's perfect. That was actually excellent. We had a few people prior to our IT snafu with you that shared that they were not familiar. So I thought that was like learn blockchain in 10 minutes. That was perfect. I mean, you're right.
Thank
There's
you.
a lot more. So I'm going to open it up. I want to get Ben involved, but I think all three of you have a different take on this next question. I am by no means a crypto expert, but I'm learning fast and furious. But in preparing for today, was reading a bunch of different articles, and one of the articles I thought was really most impressive was this notion of crypto pricing. And in it, it's mentioned this opportunity which exists in cryptocurrencies for you to create your own coin. I think the Kardashian had a coin at some point. Dogecoin was a big thing for a while. And I started thinking, is that what's fundamentally problematic about crypto? I mean, we can talk, and we're going to hear from an expert shortly on the reg side, but this whole notion that tonight I can go home and decide to make a coin, the Tiger coin, because I just feel like making a new coin. And if enough people and if enough hype, right, if I'm able to get Ludacris to say, I like this Tiger coin, then there's suddenly a market, then there's suddenly like people sending me money or trading for it. And so I want to weigh in, or have you all weigh in on this. Is part of the problem with crypto the notion that you can sort of sell fiat currency?
Couple comments related to that. First of all, my perspective comes from tech origin, and I'm a sort of blockchain OG, in that I actually wrote a paper in my master's thesis on hash code methods in storage chaining 50 years ago. So when we a lot of the seeds of the engines that we're talking about have a long legacy and certainly a long tail. But the principle as I progress into thinking on the business side of it, a lot of the objectives and growth was to circumvent or at least proceed where possible outside of the traditional sovereign state regulations. So these are often grew. They're healthy technologies that grew via the leverage of piratical communities that leveraged the freedom that was proffered by those abilities. So I come back to the first principles is that in digital assets, you have the nature of abundance, that anything that's a digital asset can be replicated ad nauseum, and yet values based on scarcity. So if I want to create scarcity from abundance, I have to have a means of artificially, if you will, creating a sense of scarcity. So the blockchain is with its immutable record and distributed ledger structures, create an opportunity for me to create a sense of scarcity. So I can create Nicole coin, and Nicole coin is valuable because I'm going to define a scarcity for it. So there's a market, and Tiffany's already grabbing a hold of those coins even as we speak. And so what we're looking for is the mechanisms. We tend to look on at coins against alignment with our monetary practices. And then we talk about alignment with our security exchange practices, when in fact, these things come from outside of that. And so what hygiene do we attribute to operating within those spaces? If Bitcoin grew popular in part by the pirate community that wanted to avoid the sovereign state or sovereign state agency record, it was in part to stay away from that as much as possible. And yet the regulatory entities know and see the value in the engines and operations of these ecosystems. So we don't want to solve the problem just on the currency side, and we're faced with the notion of securities now as well, as to how we get a discipline, a hygiene, a practice that doesn't fold the promise of digital assets wholly into our old ways of doing things, but how do we create some hygiene for those practices?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is similar, but I'm going to say it differently. I think that, so there is the ability to create coins, but that's not supposed to be the purpose. So the question is like, what is the end game? Like, what is the goal? And I've had this discussion with a lot of folks in the industry that the reason that we're at this particular crossroads is because there is an over focus on the financialization of these assets. Like Bitcoin is supposed to be a store of value, but yet we have the ability to create all of these coins, and a lot of people are pumping them and getting celebrities, other people to invest in them, not because there's a use case, but because they want to make a dollar. And when you're when you have a focus on making something into a means to make income, then it starts to look more like a security versus a commodity, like, right? And so I think we need to go back to first principles about like, one, like what are we trying to solve for? And even like bring this back directly to FTX, like, you know, when Nelson went through like Bitcoin and solving the trust issue, FTX was a centralized exchange. So even how it operated was totally an opposite of the whole purpose of Bitcoin, like, right? And so I think we've just really just like, we've gotten so far away from fundamentals and the fact that the assets, like, you know, like Nelson was making, if you had bought, you know, Bitcoin when the first Bitcoin was minted like 10 years ago, now, like, would have appreciated, you would be rich, you would be retired, we'd all be retired, like, right? But that isn't supposed to be the purpose. And I think like all these other incentives kind of murked up what the purpose was. And I think in order for the industry to move forward from here, we need to go back to first principles and figure out like what the end game is. And if indeed we're trying to make the financial system more accessible, or if there's other use cases, like what are we trying to do and what's the purpose? And it solely can't be for someone to get rich.
Nelson, do you have any thoughts on that? Or anything to add?
Yeah, I guess just a couple, I agree with everything that's been said so far, right? And I think the end game is a really good point, because, before I really kind of fell down this rabbit hole hard in early 2014, I thought I had a good understanding what money is. And now the longer and longer I've spent in this industry working with people, and really working with people that come into it with fresh eyes from different perspectives, the less and less I feel like I know what money is and what value really is. And I think kind of thinking back on that graphic I showed, and Ben, I'd love to read your master's thesis at some point, because that actually sounds super exciting to someone like me. But all those previous innovations, there's one thing is that when the internet was built, it was built in part as kind of, the purpose was it was supposed to be a resilient information transmission network in the event of, nuclear apocalypse, right? And consequently, the focus was how do we make sure that information flows and we'll get to where we want it to go. So value and identity were not built into the internet from the beginning in the protocols that basically allow us to, allow me to join this conference via Zoom. And so now, as you were saying, Nicole, what's stopping you from starting Tiger Coin or starting Nicole Coin? I mean, we could do that actually during the conference. It would take mere minutes, but that gets to this idea of the end game. Like, okay, where is all this going, right? Is this supposed to kind of democratize finance? As a lot of DeFi people, claim it is. It's supposed to bank the unbanked. These are all noble goals, and I think that they're worth pursuing. But the mechanisms by which we achieve those, I don't think have really been fully fleshed out. And the other thing is crypto or Web3, whatever you want to call it, has not really hit kind of the consumer grade level in the sense of it's a fairly closed ecosystem, despite, I would say, kind of calls for concern from people like Senator Elizabeth Warren, who think it may be a contagion that could kind of pollute the traditional financial system. I don't know if we're really there yet. And part of the reason is really only other crypto people by and large care about coins and what they can or cannot do. That's changing more and more every day. I have clients that are really focused on that. I think the NFT boom, for whatever reason, really resonated with the public and brought more people into this idea of, scarce value on the internet that's not tied to a traditional institution. Great. But what comes next, right? For me, and then I'll stop talking here, but for me, I've thought the end game may be some sort of kind of parallel reserve financial system, whether that's Bitcoin or something else operating as kind of like akin to the US dollar, right? Where say you're engaged in international business in some capacity, the dollar is king, better or worse, right? Well, maybe Bitcoin or other crypto kind of fill that role. But you can see how other use cases, given the cross-border nature of this and the global nature of these technologies, could also slip in, right? Whether it's exchanging information, whether it's logistics, shipping, the list goes on and on.
Yeah, I'd like to add just a couple of points real quick, and that is I'm a little concerned if we perceive that we can find one end game that's the target on here, and especially if it's strictly around monetization and financial side. The value of the digital asset and its ability to create a scarce identity for uniqueness. I work with Vinsurf and Tim Berners-Lee in a project called People-Centered Internet that is looking from a privacy and control standpoint? Or are you looking in France at art provenance and blockchain leverage there? I look at records, record establishment in the real estate records and through centuries in the UK and other uses. I think we have purposing that gives direction to the skill sets that we're developing in digital assets. So we should not just get preoccupied with the mechanisms of monetization, especially where their purpose in many ways seems to be to circumvent the social and community rules and regulations that have existed in different security domains. Other than that, I have no opinion.
There's so much that was touched on here. I'm trying to like filter it in my brain, but two things that came out of the sort of remarks from everyone. One, I love the notion of end game, and I agree with you, Ben, it could be multiple, but I think what we do in Tiger, there's a mantra I'm always asking the students, well, what problem are we solving, right? Because we look at different technologies and different innovations all the time. But if we don't focus on the problem, then it could just be a technology for technology's sake. So I am a super fan of blockchain for all the reasons that Nelson laid out. And there's so many other use cases outside of the financial markets that I think are excellent. But when you now incorporate it in the financial system, it really gets complicated. And a couple of thoughts I had going into this, I was looking for a speaker to talk about some of the sociological aspects where I think Nelson mentioned banking the unbanked or democratizing the financial system. You know, there's a huge swath of folks in the US that don't have bank accounts. I mean, I know that seems really strange to the folks here in this room, but there's a swath, let's just put it this way. I don't have a number, but a lot. And when crypto first sort of started gaining a lot of mainstream traction, the Black and Brown community was definitely more involved in terms of thinking about investing or using it as a way to have access to the financial system. And I think what has happened since, you know, some folks have clearly made some profits from it and others have been severely hurt, right? Because even your 10-minute intro, which was super helpful for me, Nelson, required some knowledge of a lot of other things, right? So we're dealing with some sophisticated technology. So you don't want to put that in the hands of people who don't have the capacity to really fully understand where their money is going to go once they start investing. So that's one comment. The other thought, though, I had was sort of leaning in the other direction. I also know there's tons of folks, communities, governments outside the US that are using crypto, that are allowing you, and I mean, there's some US firms actually that will allow you to use crypto to pay your legal services bill. And I'm thinking to myself, how can crypto work in some communities and feel so open to fraud, at least in the US, or maybe we're not aware of some of the fraudulent activities that could be occurring outside. I'm fully aware of the sort of information scarcity component to this comment, but I'm just sort of laying those out as like talking points for you guys in terms of thinking about. I do think we're at an inflection point, right, with this FTX collapse, and I'm hoping the engineer in me is hoping we can take what clearly is broken about allowing opportunities for fraud to creep in, to fix it, and to fix it in a way that will, and I know I'm altruistic. Tiffany's looking at me like, girl, we can't fix it. I'm like, we can try to fix it. But ways we can fix it, or at least go back to the before time, right? The 2018, 2019, where there were all of these hopeful-ish statements about what we can do and try to revisit that, you know, try to think about the end game again. So thoughts, and I know I can tell your brain is like, I got it.
Well, you know, I could address both. I'll do the first question. I'll leave the second to someone else because the first one is like literally my like pet project. And Commissioner Johnson, I'm gonna use my favorite quote. So talk about this all the time because like thinking about like the unbanked and the underbanked and how like, you know, from a banking perspective, I do some financial services work. Like we kind of discovered that there's lots of people who don't have access to the internet that do have smartphones. And so you can give them services on smartphones, you open up all of this potential. And so, with crypto, there was a promise of financial inclusion. Financial inclusion means that you're going to make someone's life better by giving them access to financial products. But instead, where we are is, ready for it? Financial access, right? Financial access is not the same as financial inclusion. So what happened was, because we don't have the same intermediaries with the same requirements standing in between crypto products and services, more people who historically did not have access to the financial markets were allowed to trade crypto. We're allowed to engage in lending, all of these other types of products that we say, oh, no, for the sophisticated, et cetera, right? And we gave people that access without lessons such as diversification. Don't put all of your eggs in one basket. Maybe even though you could do this, and some people have made a lot of money from doing this, you probably should. You should think about these things. And so part of the issue, what we've seen and why, like, not only FTX, but Celsius, Gemini, like all of these other implosions were terrible, and they really hurt people of color. Benn in particular, is that people don't have the diversification necessary to withstand all of these collapses, right? So I think going forward, and the Savin and Bozeman bill, which was kind of dead now because it was somewhat entangled with SBF, like one of the components there was a part about financial literacy in informing communities who were going to use these products, not from a protectionist point of view. Don't do it. We're going to cut off access, but these are the things you should know. So I think, again, going back to first principles about where what the promise was, where we were at, I think there's an opportunity to give people to get to financial inclusion, but we need to focus on those particular principles and give people the education and make sure we have better, we actually have laws in place to prevent the commingling of proprietary and customer funds, and prevent people from taking outside risk of other people's money, right? So we need the regulation to fall in place, but I'm still hopeful that one day we get to financial inclusion.
Well, I think that is so important, Tiffany. I reflect on in Kenya, for example, M-Pesa, the payment system that grew with not smartphone technology, but flip phone technology, because the operating infrastructure, especially for the non-banked, was not a level of sophistication, and it otherwise forced people into a banking structure that was alien to their lifestyle. In India, you have the same thing with Aadhaar activity as well. I had a message from one of my former high school classmates in Chicago yesterday, who's a Latinx, and as he said, so many of the elderly community in the Latin community had suffered exactly this, because they weren't able to do the diversity. They concentrated and they lost big. So there were Latinx families that in pursuit of just staying stable, were not fully educated to the opportunities, and were diverted into these and lost everything. And that in the games people play, they don't always understand the consequence, the secondary consequences of it. So if some of the first principles are dealing like in Kenya, with creating an infrastructure that served an inclusive community and did not proffer or direct people into a banking system or a governmental derived system, that we need to take some of those missions first.
All right, I want to turn us to sort of the regulatory complexity a little bit here. And Tiffany, this is where I'm going to put you on the spot first. So we've got the commissioner from the CFTC here today. So that's one regulatory body. The other major regulatory body, of course, is the SEC. But then there's a third, if I remember correctly, which is just, is it a financial asset instrument, or I know some of that's CFTC, but there's a third.
I mean, well, the third is like either banking regulators, and then the states are really the fourth.
So, given the map and crypto, sort of give us like a primer in terms of like, here's who regulates what, like who's on first.
Yeah, so today, and historically, the states have been up first, right? So there was the view that crypto assets were not securities, right? That they were commodities, that they were a form of store of value. And so they were regulated at the state level as money services businesses. That's the same regime that exists for like Western Union. So if you think about it, it really doesn't fit neatly. So for the most part, regulated at the state level as money services businesses, there were a few states like New York that has a BIT license that has crypto specific regulation. At the federal level, money services businesses are licensed by Treasury and FinCEN, but that's like a registration like application. It's not like a very comprehensive regulatory regime subject to rules and examinations like you have for securities and commodities, right? So that's kind of where we started. And most crypto companies today are regulated at the state level, like that's our primary regulator. Next level up is if you are a commodity, right? If you're in the spot market, meaning that someone purchases it, and it's delivered within 28 days, there's no federal regulator for that particular transaction. But if you lie, steal, or cheat, commit fraud, the CFTC has jurisdiction over that. The CFTC also has jurisdiction over futures, forwards, anything that's over 28 days. And so if you follow enforcement actions, you might have seen some actions where you had crypto companies that ended up sometimes intentionally, sometimes inadvertently having forwards or futures contracts and getting in trouble with the CFTC. The other major regulator in the space is the SEC, and they only have jurisdiction over securities. The current SEC commissioner and the prior SEC commissioner have expressed the view that they think most crypto assets are securities. And similarly, a lot of crypto products, lending, yield, et cetera, are securities. And so you have this kind of tug of war where you have the SEC asserting jurisdiction, yet the regulatory requirements that apply to securities intermediaries are not tailored for the crypto market, which is different. So even though the SEC, for example, has a regulatory framework for what's called a special purpose broker-dealer, a broker-dealer that can trade digital asset securities and have custody over them, 0 people have actually signed up for that particular regulatory regime. They confirmed it in writing in black and white just 2 weeks ago during a rule proposal, right? So that's kind of like the push and pull. And what we really need is, because like, there's uncertainty as like there's the SEC's view, there's the crypto industry's view of these are not securities, these are commodities, therefore we don't have a primary spot regulator. What we really need is for Congress to come in and be very clear about, 1, who has jurisdiction, and then 2, create or direct one of the agencies to create laws that actually take into account the differences between cryptocurrencies and the traditional securities or commodities or whatever the market is, because that's kind of where the gap is. And that's why you can say to the market to come in and register. That's why they're not all running in, because there's not a regulatory framework that takes into account the differences and the nuances of crypto as compared to TradFi.
All right, I'm gonna keep you on the spot here. You've got all the good juju and nuggets. So here's my understanding of commodities. How many people have seen Trading Places with Eddie Murphy? Okay, you know where I was going. So I don't know what the difference between a commodity, unless it's like orange juice futures, and a security. So like, give us that distinction, so then we can really understand like how crypto is so amorphous.
So the definition of commodity is extremely broad. I'm not a commodities lawyer, so I can't cite the definition, but the way I think about it is, if something, first you start off with is something that's security. And in crypto, The test that they use most commonly is from a 1946 Supreme Court decision, SEC versus Howey. So the test is investment of money, a common enterprise with the expectation of profits derived based on the efforts of others. So the starting point, how it's kind of arrived in practice, is determining whether or not an asset or service or product is a security. And then if not, there's a kind of the assumption that it's a commodity unless it's a banking product, which gets even more complicated. So that's kind of like the starting point. And like security, shorthand, security is like really for investment purposes. You're buying it because you want it to go up in value. You are reliant on a third party or someone else to help drive up the value of it, to market it to whatever. Commodity historically has really been for use. Like commodities markets are about like, you're gonna buy oil and you wanna like, because you need to use oil. Like you're gonna buy carbon, you're gonna need to use carbon. So it's really more of a use-based market with institutional players, like, right? So it's also kind of different from where we are from crypto versus like securities is really about investment and buying with the hope of appreciation.
Well, then does the move from on Ethereum to with the quote merge and the shift over into proof of stake, does that cross the line then into the security classification?
Well, it's a great question. You know, the heads of the both the SEC and CFTC have conflicting views on that point. Like, right? So it's a great question. One would think because right now, to get technical, your assets on Ethereum are locked until the migration is completed, right? And so if I want to get my yield in Ethereum, I'm reliant on all of the validators to finish the merge so I can get my assets back in my yield, like, right? So that starts to look more like Howey, but that's an open question, as I said, that the chairs of SEC and CFTC have different views about.
Nelson, do you have any thoughts? I know, I'm just like fascinated. We're moving into our remarks from the commissioner, so this is like perfect segue and getting your mind right.
Yeah, I think where everyone gets tripped up is that these things are multifunctional, right? They have different purposes depending on what the whole point of a project is and how people are using them, right? So, you know, there exists, for example, DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, which are collections of individuals and organizations somewhere on the earth who've come together for some particular project. Sometimes it's NFT generative art projects, right? And the members of the DAOs are using assets, crypto assets, to determine rules as to how art may be generated, if there's additional benefits that are associated with that. Okay, well, you have use of tokens that are from that DAO. That use decides, you know, how art and NFTs are generated. I mean, that could be a commodity, it could be a security, it could be both. You know, FinCEN, which was mentioned earlier, treats basically all of these things as money. The IRS says it's property you got to pay taxes on. Tax lawyers are, I would say, enjoying themselves. They may not admit to that, but enjoying themselves, trying to figure out, okay, I staked these particular assets and I think I got a loss, but I converted them to these other assets, and what's going to be, I mean, I've heard conversations about, you know, unborn calves and, you know, how that's akin to what's going on here. I hate tax, so I just don't really pay attention. But the point is, these things are lots of things all at once, right? You can't just look at them. And I think it's that kind of native kind of digital nature of it. One other point I wanted to add is that, you know, the quote unquote lack of regulatory clarity that you often hear people in the industry crow about, I don't know if I buy that. In part because the skeptic in me always looks at a transaction or a project and just says, well, okay, who's making money off of this? How are they making money? I think that informs a lot of legal analysis, especially when you think of how a federal judge would look at something like this. You get kind of a techno mumbo jumbo explanation of a project and why it's different. And a judge is going to ask, okay, well, who made money? How did they make money, right? But the other thing is, I know a lot of crypto lawyers and a lot of projects who are just intentionally trying to do everything in their power to avoid the US markets. And I do think long-term that's a bad thing, regardless of whether or not crypto is able to live up to, its more noble ideals and intentions. I hope it can, but I do know that there is a big shift to not do business here because of what some people, rightly or wrongly, I think it's a bit overblown, but rightly or wrongly think is kind of a heavy-handed approach to this. Now, I will also say that some jurisdictions in the world have just completely opened their arms way too much to the industry. And whether or not, they truly appreciate what they're letting in is a different question.
That's a good point. I'm gonna leave you guys an opportunity to share a few last words, but one of the thoughts I had in terms of as we think about what potential regulatory scheme we might adopt in the US, it will still only, reside in US jurisdiction. So as the rest of the world, unless, and I'm gonna let Tiffany correct me, she's the expert, unless, if we allow the rest of the world to sort of advance the ball a little bit more, I think that will overcomplicate what the sort of future of crypto will look like, at least in practice in the US. But again, I'm still hopeful because I'm Pollyannish about this, that collapse of FTX is sort of like the thing that, we're broken and now we're going to rebuild. But parting words, last thoughts before we introduce the commissioner on what do you see happening? What's next for crypto from Tiffany's perspective, and then Ben?
What's next? In the immediate future, there will be lots of enforcement actions, potentially some congressional hearings. I hope that results in having Congress take action. But I am hopeful that on the other side, we'll get to a better, more ideals-based use of the technology.
I agree with that. I hope we attend to large problems. And these are large problems themselves, but even larger to get at some of the first principles of digital assets and digital asset management going forward. That could be a leadership role for the United States in some of these domains as well. We see great experiments, Singapore and others that are running effective experiments, but I think we can provide principled leadership in some of these areas as we move into digital domains. And I'm speaking to metaverse, I'm speaking to NFTs, I'm speaking to all those spaces where digital assets are coming. We can't keep starting out by saying no rules need apply, and as we tend to do.
Yeah, I would
Last
just
words? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would build off of what Ben was saying there, in particular with respect to the metaverse. I mean, I guess I've probably read way too much science fiction over the years growing up and whatnot, but I think things are going to get a lot weirder before they get a lot more normal and calm. And in particular, and I can speak from direct experience working with clients building out privacy tech, there is just a lot of stuff coming in the pipeline from very talented, smart people, where some of these questions are going to be somewhat moot because it will be technologically impossible and just not really feasible to even know who's engaged in transactions. And at present, we don't really have a regulatory regime anywhere in the world that's purpose-built to kind of figure out how to deal with that outright, of short of just banning these things. So I'm long-term hopeful as this, as a new coordination technology. And short term, I'm guarded because I think it'll get very weird.
I like that. I want to thank our panelists because I think you guys are fabulous. As we transition to our keynote remarks from the commissioner, I'm going to stand up. right, perfect. All right, I am delighted to present to you guys Commissioner Kristin Johnson. Commissioner Johnson was sworn in as a CFTC Commissioner on March 30th, 2022, after being nominated by President Joe Biden in September 21. Can you guys? And unanimously confirmed by the Senate. Commissioner Johnson is a nationally recognized expert on financial markets with management, law, and policy, with a specialization in the regulation of complex financial products, including the origination, distribution, and secondary market trading, clearing, and settlement of securities and derivatives. She is an internationally recognized expert on financial markets regulation and corporate governance, compliance, and risk management. Her recent work examines the implications of the emerging innovative technologies, including distributed ledger assets, distributed ledger tech, that enable the creation of digital assets and intermediary and artificial intelligence technologies that target commercial and consumer financial transactions, transfers, and investments. And the other part about Commissioner Johnson is she is a lovely member of the Emory Law faculty. Her scholarship includes capital and credit markets. Prior to Emory, she was at Tulane Law. Prior to Tulane, she was in private practice. She worked for, I'm gonna put it the way your Commissioner Meyer says, a leading bank or financial institution as vice president and assistant general counsel. It's only like 3 or 4, so one of them. And she's got a wonderful little son named Jackson, who's adorable, amazing as well. So all things Commissioner Johnson, you come up here and share your remarks with us.
Hi guys, good afternoon. I don't know about you, but I could use a little round of caffeine right about now. So I'm going to project all the energy toward you that I would love to have coursing through my veins in the form of a tall caramel macchiato. Thanks so much, Nicole, for having me. I'm tremendously grateful to be here today. Grateful to join you as you celebrate the 8th annual Tiger program. And I'll have to offer my anticipated disclaimer. The remarks I'll share today are my own. They are not the opinions or beliefs of my fellow commissioners or the chair or the staff at the CFTC. During a media interview last fall, someone asked me what the Commodity Futures Trading Commission could do to prevent crypto market crises that lead to substantial losses for retail investors, potentially devastating consequences for hardworking Americans, too many of whom face fragile financial circumstances. I instinctively answered, we must never let a good crisis go to waste. Today, I repeat that call to action, and I am internally and publicly advocating for the CFTC to introduce and actively enforce new regulations consistent with our core principles in certain retail markets that may be vulnerable to crises. The approach will ensure parallel customer protections, enhance market integrity and market stability, and mitigate crises in crypto communities. I'm also urging Congress to include in any new legislation statutory authority for the CFTC to conduct effective due diligence on any firm not already subject to the CFTC's oversight that seeks to purchase 10% or more of the equity interest in a CFTC registered exchange or clearinghouse. I'm also encouraging my fellow commissioners to consider, with the utmost urgency, initiating a notice and comment process to identify a path that ensures that the commission has greater visibility into the financial health, corporate governance, and risk management processes of any business seeking to acquire a significant equity ownership stake in a CFTC registered entity. Now, why all of this hullabaloo about the purchasing? I'll get there in just a second. While our existing approach, deeply influenced by custom and tradition, serves as an effective soft power in the context of recent acquisitions of CFTC registered exchanges and clearinghouses, I am concerned that moral suasion may not be sufficient for the hard cases. In times of crisis, with expanding access to retail markets and increasingly diverse market participants, relying on other regulatory frameworks such as antitrust law, or any of the other regulators that the panel described, may simply not be sufficient or too limited in scope. So here's the backstory. Less than 2 years ago, after FTX's acquisition of LedgerX, customers, creditors, and market participants serving as counterparties find themselves navigating the deep, dark, troubled waters of FTX bankruptcy and the sale of LedgerX. Preliminary bids for businesses seeking to acquire LedgerX, an FTX affiliated entity that is not a debtor, but part of the bankruptcy proceedings to satisfy outstanding creditors, are due yesterday. The sales process will likely conclude later this spring. In order to fulfill its customer protection, market integrity, and market stability mandates, the CFTC should have the authority to engage in appropriate due diligence during the acquisition of a CFTC registered exchange or clearinghouse, including one that's in the bankruptcy proceedings. These proposed amendments should offer genuine fixes to the gaps in our regulation. Some require only commission action, others require more. If implemented in real time, these amendments will ensure the protection of customer assets, codifying segregation of customer money for proprietary or house money. I think the panel earlier referenced that as well. In a nutshell, let's not let folks gamble with other people's money. We must prevent liquidity crises by implementing financial resource requirements that obligate firms servicing retail markets to maintain sufficient working capital to sustain operations, or in the event of a liquidity crisis, to ensure an orderly liquidation or wind down. We should establish requirements for the adoption of conflicts of interest policies and establish authority, as I've suggested, for the Commission to conduct effective due diligence in the context of sale. So let's back out from the storyline and the really intense policy suggestions I've offered for just a moment. As was described by the Dean in her opening remarks and Nicole in her introduction, a little over a year ago, I taught a class, my very last class of the spring semester in this room. I'm really so serious, just a few months shy of a year ago. And I was co-teaching with the Dean. It was a tremendous delight. And someone else here in the room knows that the story is even more interesting because not minutes after I taught my very last class and had driven home from my house just less than a mile up the road, I was called by the White House to say, you can be sworn in now. So not nearly enough of a vacation between those two things. Let me just say that. Needless to say, when President Biden indicated his intent to nominate me to serve as a CFTC Commissioner, I took it as an honor and a privilege, and I am eternally grateful. On March 30th, 2022, I was unanimously sworn in by the United States Senate, and shortly thereafter sworn in just down the hall to serve. In the years before I joined the Commission, as Professor Moore described, I studied and explored risk management issues and worked as a transactional lawyer and an in-house counsel at a large financial institution. Over the last several years, my research centered on issues at the intersection of finance and technology, or fintech, focusing on distributed digital ledger technology or blockchain technology, the theory and implications of disintermediation or non-intermediation, and the integration of artificial intelligence in finance and throughout society. My most recent publications immediately ahead of my leaving to support the administration, the Commission, and our country was essentially focused on the need for heightened regulatory oversight of cryptocurrency exchanges, collaboration among financial market regulators, and the need to introduce as quickly as possible critical, foundational, risk management, corporate governance, and compliance measures in crypto markets. I think these basic foundational principles are especially important for fledgling firms, particularly those introducing novel asset classes and operational infrastructure and soliciting retail investors. In the wake of the recent crises in crypto markets, I would suggest that we engage in an old-fashioned M&M. For those who are unfamiliar, in medical schools or in hospitals where there's been a death or a loss that is difficult to explain, the doctors will engage in a morbidity and mortality assessment. This postmortem offers clear insights into the issues at the center of our concerns, and for our purposes, the center of a series of recent crypto firm collapses. In the first part of my speech, I'll describe cascading losses, collapsing crypto firms, and calls for reform. Why, one might ask, or what, one might ask, might be gained from studying these crises. First, crises have the potential to create catastrophic costs for customers, creditors, investors, and the domestic and international economy. Second, factors that lead to corporate governance and risk management failures are often predictable and can be foreseen and in fact prevented. Third, the experience that firms have had with respect to corporate governance and risk management failures can often repeat themselves. In other words, a firm goes into bankruptcy protection and only later reemerges from bankruptcy to solicit and expose new customers to devastating losses because the firms continue to rely on the same deeply deficient and possibly non-existent governance, compliance, and risk management programs. Unfortunately, unless these firms learn from their experience and adopt a culture of compliance that effectively alters behavior and closes gaps in risk management and corporate governance, they will find themselves repeating the same cycle. For almost a decade, but with increasing frequency in the last few months, international media headlines repeatedly and sometimes weekly, even daily, present a new cautionary tale. The cautionary tale is woven together by a set of common threads. Picture this: an almost 30-year-old CEO launches an international crypto exchange. Within a few years, the founder and the exchange achieve crypto celebrity status. At the peak, the exchange captures significant market share, processing a sizable percentage of global coin and token transactions. The firm, organized in a jurisdiction outside the United States, lacks many aspects of traditional corporate governance, including oversight by a qualified, informed, and engaged board of directors and management. All too often, the corporate governance and risk management and compliance systems for this firm fail to effectively ensure anti-money laundering and know your customer programs and conflicts of interest policies exist. Like lightning striking in an instant, the exchange suspends trading, shutters the windows for withdrawal, silences traffic on its website, and files for bankruptcy protection, leaving customers infuriated, investors stunned, and creditors scrambling in a foot race to the courthouse. Interconnectedness among crypto firms, amplified by fragile or non-existent risk management, corporate governance, and conflicts of interest policy, fuel crises. In the late spring of 2022, a run on the fourth largest stablecoin and 10th largest cryptocurrency, Terra USD, led to a precipitous decline in the value of UST, and in tandem, a sell-off of Luna, its companion token. A broad market sell-off and cascading losses followed. With the onset of a crypto winter, a number of highly influential and central crypto firms launched toward bankruptcy. With significant exposure to Terra Luna, Three Arrows Capital, a Singapore-based crypto hedge fund, defaulted on a loan to crypto lender Voyager Digital. On July 1st, 2022, less than a week later, 3AC filed for bankruptcy protection. Almost on cue, a week later, Voyager halted trades, deposits, and withdrawals, and filed for bankruptcy protection as well. 8 days later, another crypto lender, Celsius Network, also filed for bankruptcy. In early November, FTX and BlockFi joined the list of crypto firms seeking bankruptcy protection, and the list continues to grow. Just last week, the crypto lending units of Genesis filed for bankruptcy. These stories of the devastating losses experienced by unsuspecting retail investors, lured by marketing schemes and transactions that render their investments worthless, converting customers into general unsecured creditors in crypto firm bankruptcies, leave us with sobering questions and too few answers. Thoughtful commentators have, however, suggested a number of possibilities. If we are able to achieve, even if we are unable to achieve a first best policy solution in a single step, the Commission can take steps to better protect customers and mitigate the contagion of collapsing crypto firms. This may stem the rising tide of crypto crises, or at least minimize the scale and scope of crisis-generated spillover effects. Adopting these critical customer protections and risk controls today lessens the likelihood that we will face fresh crypto crises tomorrow. A week after FTX filed for bankruptcy, I delivered a keynote address at the annual meeting of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago Financial Markets Group. I emphasized during that meeting the need to be proactive in adopting internal governance and risk management measures that introduce important provisions. I've highlighted a number of these today. I won't list them again. I'll simply share that later that same week at Stanford Law School Crypto Policy Conference, I explained the need for the Commission to have a seat at the table as the court and creditors consider an appropriate buyer in the sale of the non-debtor Ledger X, the affiliated entity that I suggested was part of the FTX bankruptcy. While there has been a general acknowledgement of the need for any buyer to be familiar with, that's actually the exact and only relevant language here, to be familiar with commodities regulations, a historic acquiescence to Commission inquiries has prompted presumptions that we can await the outcomes quietly on the sidelines. Particularly in times of crisis, when there is a low threshold, particularly when there are times of crisis, such a low threshold may not be sufficient to ensure that the Commission receives meaningful access and information regarding all aspects of the transaction in real time. The second part of my presentation today, I'd like to talk a little bit about identifying solutions for crypto crises. Too many crypto market firms are careening toward crises. While congressional action, a first best solution may be far off, firms themselves can take immediate action to address some of the challenges that are triggering crises. The CFTC's remit is overseeing the commodity derivatives market, and our mission is to promote the integrity, resilience, and vibrancy of the U.S. derivatives markets through sound regulation. This policy mandate includes an obligation to guard against illicit activity and ensure market integrity and stability to advance the safety and soundness of derivatives markets. As a reference point for how and why we might carry out this mission, many would point to the financial crisis in 2008. I would point to something that happened a bit earlier. A little over a decade ago, a precipitous decline in the value of high-yield European sovereign debt oil markets. Commentators and pundits marveled. Investors hurriedly assessed exposure and, where possible, took steps to liquidate holdings. While some succeeded, others did not. Unable to unwind or exit troubled positions, many investors and market intermediaries face liquidity crises. MF Global, a prominent futures commission merchant and broker-dealer, is among the most infamous firms that unraveled during this crisis. The firm was headed by John Corzine, a former Goldman Sachs alum and a former governor and senator of the state of New Jersey. Earlier, ahead of the time of this crisis, MF Global structured a portfolio of repurchase to maturity bonds. The bonds paid large coupon rates, enabling MF Global to record high profits up front. Later, the bonds were posted as collateral for short-term borrowing and delayed any risk to the firm's balance sheet until maturity. Simply stated, MF Global claimed as revenue the difference between the coupon rate of the sovereign bonds and the interest rate it paid on the loans. Taking advantage of this illusion of a shell game styled approach, MF Global's balance sheet vastly exaggerated the firm's revenues and profits and underreported the firm's exposure. Reporting its exposure at $6.3 billion, when in fact the actual exposure was likely double this figure, something like $11.5 billion. Many of you are also familiar with what happens next, or you can just pretty much guess. A steep decline in sovereign debt markets triggered demands for increased margin, and balance sheets and bank statements demonstrated insufficient liquidity to maintain positions. In an attempt to stave off creditors, to manage or mitigate the risk of a run on the firm, to deal with the mounting challenges, MF Global made the unacceptable and catastrophic decision to misappropriate, that means take, customer funds. Shortly after MF Global's parent company filed for bankruptcy, the company revealed that it had misappropriated $1.6 billion of customer funds. MF Global was registered with the CFTC as a futures commission merchant and the SEC as a broker-dealer. The CFTC's response was swift and unequivocal. As I mentioned earlier, and will note in my closing remarks, segregation, that means separation and treatment in a special way, of customer funds is fundamental to our markets. The law expressly prohibits firms like MF Global from commingling customer property with house funds or proprietary funds. Customer protection is a foundational and core principle of our market regulation. In section 4DA2 of the CEA, FCMs are required to treat and deal with futures customers' funds in very specific and special ways. Additional regulations further reinforce this point. Two hard truths from the MF Global implosion parallel the characteristics of crises in crypto markets. First, governance and risk management failures can and often do lead to crises, including liquidity crises. Second, apart from undermining the reputational integrity of the industry and fueling calls for harsh regulatory and legislative action, these failures all too often impose tremendous costs that fall disproportionately on customers. And I deeply appreciated Professor Moore's statement that marginalized customers, the most vulnerable, are often those who face those consequences hardest. For anyone who doubts this observation, consider FTX. As we begin to better understand the events that led to the FTX bankruptcy, a few facts are fairly clear. Customers, investors, and creditors face staggering losses. We continue to see knock-on effects in the industry and across markets. We are months, if not years, from unraveling the Gordian knot of conflicts of interest and absolute failure of corporate governance and the absence of effective internal controls that characterized FTX. My third and final point as I close this afternoon, applying the lessons learned, accessible solutions. Now let's identify a path forward that mitigates the number and scale of these crises. There are many entrepreneurs and emerging firms in the crypto ecosystem and the financial market services sector who are seeking to develop businesses that make valuable contributions to the economy and markets. For those firms, I believe there are critical lessons from the crisis that we should explore today. These suggestions merit consideration. When FTX filed for bankruptcy protection from creditors, regulators received a deluge of criticism. Too few of those critics recognize that FTX's parent company was organized outside of the United States, and FTX's representations indicated that there were no U.S. customers trading on their platform. As a result, the CFTC and other regulators generally had limited visibility into the operations of the firm. FTX did, however, in late 2021, acquire an entity that I referenced earlier, LedgerX. What I'll share with you now in detail is that in the context of the FTX bankruptcy, in the immediate moment, LedgerX is a solvent entity and we can account for all of its customer funds. What, you might ask, has led to the disparate outcomes for customers and creditors of Ledger? That as of FTX's bankruptcy, the CFTC has had boots on the ground at LedgerX, an entity that has been subject to periodic examinations and review, had adopted risk management governance and cyber system safeguards required by our regulations for any registered exchange or clearinghouse. And perhaps most importantly, the commission staff has engaged in daily communication with LedgerX and related third-party service providers, including banks and other payment platforms, to ensure that all of LedgerX's customer funds are accounted for on a daily basis. Finally, LedgerX has been subject to financial resource requirements that obligate the firm to hold in reserve working capital to ensure the integrity of the firm as a going concern and sufficient resources for an orderly wind down if such a process comes to be necessary. I'll say a very last few words, and then I'll close. We can observe several lessons from the recent crypto crises that I've suggested. These lessons should prompt market participants, investors, and creditors to take immediate action to ensure or shore up the integrity of their own internal affairs. We've long explored the contours of corporate governance in TradFi markets, and there are benefits to leveraging the governance, disclosure, and risk management lessons learned from other crises or crises in other markets for crypto markets today. Consider, for example, Lehman, Bear Stearns, MF Global, or in the context of capital markets, Enron, WorldCom, Tyco. I'm urging Congress to consider adding provisions to any proposed legislation that alters aspects of the CFTC's jurisdiction to ensure that we adopt parallel protections for customers in intermediated and non-intermediated or disintermediated markets. I'm encouraging my fellow commissioners to consider supplementing current regulation to begin to implement the same protections. Through my role as sponsor of the Commission's Market Risk Advisory Committee, I'm standing up a Future of Finance subcommittee that I hope will engage in collaborative dialogues with market participants, consumer advocates, fellow regulators, and other agencies, and many of you. Our markets are global, and our goal and service is to preserve the stability and integrity of global markets and create effective customer protections that reduce the risks of crises. Finally, we will address, no doubt, in the Q&A, the gap that exists in the context of spot market oversight for cryptocurrency markets. In other parts of the world, we could note that regulators or legislators have moved to close that gap and to fully articulate solutions. The contours of that legislation and legislation pending in Congress are very much still under construction. I look forward to continuing my conversations with international regulators, with regulators here in the United States across financial markets, and with so many of you. Thank you for allowing me to join you for this for the conference today. It's really a pleasure beyond words. Apart from all of my very personal memories about teaching here at the law school, I just feel very touched and privileged that the very first significant academic work that I did examine cryptocurrency exchanges, I presented here as a workshop to the faculty in the context of their consideration of my appointment. So just wonderful to be here. Feels like coming home. Thank you so much.
All right, I promise we will open it up for some questions. I just have like one question to get you going. That water should be here. All right, so I want to center it on the consumer because I think we've got a lot of voices here and this is being recorded, so it'll be helpful. Should the centralized crypto platforms, so you named several that the CFTC is looking at, should they be required to disaggregate the exchange, the custody, and the brokering and dealing aspects of their business, right? And then be prohibited from offering more than one, right? Like, let's break them apart. I think of sort of like, to your point, antitrust, such that you can better see what's going on in terms of the asset holdings and what they're doing.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Professor Moritz. One thing I'm emphasizing in this speech and have actually emphasized in a couple of speeches leading up to this point is sort of pure customer fund segregation regulation. So in the context of banking, we've talked about the idea that there are different regulatory authorities for different types of transactions in our markets. In the context of banking, for example, any of you who have a checking or savings account with a traditional licensed, state or federally licensed banking institution, there are a plethora of regulations that govern the extent to which and what uses and even what places your money that has been deposited into those banks can be held, purposes for which they could be used. And over time, we have continuously reinforced that those regulations because people have creative ideas about things that may not fall neatly within the buckets that we've outlined. And so in my mind, what I would describe that as a kind of regulatory arbitrage. It's looking for the place where the rule is not clear, and then take action. And all too often that action can lead to the firm finding itself in trouble. And so essentially we kind of continuously engage in a dialogue. I would call it a regulatory dialectic, whereby regulated entities and regulators are hashing out, if you will, for lack of a more eloquent term, what the contours are, what happens in the margins in terms of the activities that entities can undertake. That process is paralleled in securities markets. For broker dealers who hold customer funds, we have similarly a very rigorous set of regulations. In commodities markets, and I love that you guys were sort of parsing through this earlier. God bless you, because I don't know how often anybody is sitting down attempting to dig deep into these questions. But in a nutshell, in securities markets, broker dealers, in commodities markets, futures commission merchants play an intermediary role. And what I said before is one of the biggest shifts we're looking at when we think about cryptocurrency or digital asset is shifting from a place where all financial transactions are directed toward a central intermediary to a universe where we have a disaggregation, to your point, of how those transactions come to be recorded on a blockchain. And with that, we could dig into CeFi versus DeFi in the crypto space. But just for now, I want to answer your question in two parts. And the first is that segregation of customer funds. We built those rules that I've described around intermediaries because we've assumed the presence of intermediaries because that's how our markets work. We're long past a place where we trade directly with one another. I'll give you 2 of my cows if you give me a goat, I don't know, whatever, right? Bushel of corn. We're long past that point where we're going to wheel the wheelbarrow around and directly trade with one another in the context of assets that would be commodities. And we're now using, which was wonderfully referenced earlier, money, specie, fiat, issued often by sovereign entities, sovereign governments. And there were certainly many intermediary steps along the way, right? Into private currencies ahead of sovereign currencies, et cetera. And there are lots of nuances and interesting questions. How is that sovereign currency reserve bars or oil wells, or what is the backing for that? Okay, so all of that is simply to say, when we give our money over to other people, which is the reference you heard me give in this speech, when you're dealing with other people's money, when you've been made a custodian, that's a very special relationship of trust between the person who's parted with their money and the entity that is given authority to hold that money and do other things with that money. And so we have a rigorous set of rules built around that, because we know people can have bad ideas, right? So you heard me describing that, well, if you were completely unfamiliar, that's irrelevant. You understand what's happening there because it just means somebody had a bad idea, right? It probably happened to you. Come on, admit it. You're holding somebody else's money for 5 minutes and you walk past whatever, Chipotle, I don't know what it is, right? But you just decide, I'll give them their money back when I go to the bank and take $20 out of the bank, but you might have change in your pocket from helping them do some errand, right? All I'm saying is, you have good intentions, you assume you'll make it to the bank and be able to restore their funds, but we put rules around this because good intentions pay the road to hell sometimes, right? So our thought here is we should build in good protections in spaces where anyone is being, it has become part of that relationship of trust and confidence, has entered into that very special place. Gerald Corrigan, a former Federal Reserve chair, described in an article that's been widely cited and read why banks are special. And this relationship of trust is part of the reason why banks are special. They're given something very special to us, our resources, and they're asked to take care of them. In the space where we're engaging in non-intermediated transactions, there is no central intermediary facilitating transactions for all of us occupying that space of trust. And as Nelson described earlier, it does mean that we can rely on technology maybe to accomplish some of that and to make that more visible and to make that confirmation of assets and verification of funds more distributed so that it's not concentrated in a central intermediary. There are benefits to that. There's no single point of failure, right? One of the biggest challenges with the financial crisis of 2008 is that we had really significant intermediaries. And if those intermediaries failed, a domino effect of losses across markets could trigger systemic risks that impact the global economy. Without the centralized intermediary in a non-intermediated space, one major question for regulators and markets and consumers and investors is how do we structure rules and regulations so as to get the same protections in the non-intermediated space that we enjoy in the intermediated space? And this question is really ever before us for those of you who are interested in blockchain technology or distributed digital ledger technology or cryptocurrency. There is before us an ever-present reality that we have to find a way to build those rules into the system. One suggestion might be that we use code as law. And that suggestion isn't a bad suggestion. It's just an imperfect suggestion because all of technology, at least as of this moment, has limitations and flaws. Now, I haven't had the opportunity to explore the ChatGPT flaws, but I really very much look forward to attempting to write my very next speech using that algorithm and that software. And I have no doubt that I'll have to proofread or consider carefully, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't explore the technology and sort out the technology. It's just we often may want to consider doing that in a contained environment, and an environment where the costs won't be catastrophic and won't be catastrophic for people who can scarcely fail to reestablish themselves after suffering such losses.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I have lots of other questions, but I do want to engage our audience. You guys have been super patient. I know this gentleman over here can run a panel with you. Remind me your first name again. Roop. That's right. So Roop is a local blockchain leader for those that are not familiar. But yes, tell us your question.
Thank you for organizing this, Professor Nicole. Thank you, Chairman, for being here. I have a number of
I'm just a commissioner, I'm not the chair, but I love that promotion. I'll take that.
maybe it's a
Definitely stop recording now.
it's a Freudian slip.
I'm with it. I'm with it.
I'm manifesting it.
Thank you. I'll take it.
I have a number of questions, but I'll share the broadest question of them all, which I think about often. So I agree with your views on having a new set of regulatory regime, because my view of technology is based on disruption and transformation. And we need to evolve to 21st century living and not use the laws from previous few centuries. Now, going beyond crypto, looking at the foundational blockchain technology, and even going into things like stable coins and CBDC, etc. What I see is American competitiveness issue. So we can stay here and debate all day. We can have partisan debates. I've watched both of the hearings in the Senate and in the House. I've talked to a lot of people. There's, very divided viewpoints, and they're all very valid. Nothing wrong with it. The challenge is there is a tiger at the door, which is American competitiveness and losing the reserve status of US dollar as the reserve currency, or the assumed status thus far. And then impact it has on our capital markets, on our status as a strategic power in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And I believe any type of regulation, even within crypto, which is nuancedly different from stable coins, is different from CBDC, but it moves us in that direction. So my question to you is, when you have these discussions with the American leadership in the Congress, even with SEC, do you guys think about role of American competitiveness and the ability for us to protect it, given that the future financial rails may be owned by China or Russia, given the geopolitical nature of conflict these days?
This is a great question. I'm going to start with something you said in the introduction to your question, which was about the extent to which laws organized around antiquated infrastructure. I hope I'm repeating what you eloquently stated, but laws organized around antiquated infrastructure may be ill-fitted, not fit for purpose in the context of evolving financial markets. Okay, so if that is the question, I want to actually highlight something that I do as a law professor, and this is the place where it will feel most comfortable for me to tell that story. When I teach commodities law, I begin with looking back to the writings of Socrates, because it happens to be true that Aristotle and Socrates both wrote passages that described essentially commodities market transactions. And in their text, they would describe, for example, I think Thales was the historian who wrote this, that there were in a certain part of Greece olive presses available to the many farmers who harvested olives annually. And the press was necessary because if you wanted to have olive oil, which you could use in many types of commercial transactions, nutritional dishes, various aspects of society, you had to be able to press the olives, but you had to essentially make an appointment to press your olives, and you had to estimate how long of an appointment you might need, and you might even have had to prepay a little deposit maybe on your ability to use the olive press. So there was a bit of anticipation even ahead of the harvest, and maybe sometimes even ahead of planting, to figure out exactly how much exposure you wanted to have with respect to the olive presses. Someone figures this out, snatches up all the olive press contracts, and then resells them to other people. Now, I'm not encouraging that, but what I am really hoping to point out is there are more common threads, if you will, in the history of civilizations and humanity around financial markets than one could ever imagine. I think at one point I had a senior counsel write into a speech for me a description of the earliest form of tabulating human transactions, right? As sort of an ancient Mesopotamian platform for accomplishing what we do, maybe in a spreadsheet, maybe on our phone, on some banking app today. All of that is to say, I think those threads that sort of run through the history of the world for thousands of years and tell us things about humans and their behavior really hold true for then and now. So I first want to point that out. I think there's something sacred that we know about each other, and in or behind some Rawlsian veil of ignorance. If we had to write the rules, we would write those rules in a way where if we are the counterparty facing default, or if we are the defaulting party, we would want there to be a fair process as to how things work out. So I think we have plenty to learn from. That's really one of the things I want to emphasize. We've seen so many things. There's so much for us to learn from. And to the second part of your question, what has made US financial markets premier financial markets globally is that we have had some dark moments, but we've also found a way to navigate from those dark moments to better places. And I believe most often when we do that, and that's really the crux of the speech, we figure out what went wrong and we try to adjust to fix for that. And what's very interesting to me is people can be very divided about any number of issues in politics. They could have very different perspectives about finance, but nobody wants it to be the case that markets don't work at all. Because if the markets are failing, that the consequences for that have knock-on effects for everyone in society, from manufacturing to agriculture to energy to how people put gas in their car at the pump and drive their kids to school. All of the failures that can arise in those markets really tremendously impact so many of us. And in the United States, what happened is we will run fast, I believe, and hard, and I hope that's what I'm doing now, to fix the problems when we see them springing up. Because if we don't, we will, as you suggest, relinquish our place as preeminent in financial markets. So one thing I'll say to you about what I've personally been up to is sitting down with regulators from different jurisdictions whose regulation often parallels ours. So I've been to the UK and spent time in London and sat with folks at the Bank of England or the FCA or Her Majesty's, now His Majesty's Treasury. And the idea there is simply to understand well how my cohort are thinking about structuring regulation in this space. So in the UK, there is a bill before Parliament. I think it's the Financial Market Structure Bill. There's also a bill pending on the European continent before the European Union Commission and Parliament called MiCA. And that bill also seeks to structure regulation in this space. I do not disagree with you that it is imperative that whatever our divisions are in Congress and our disagreements, we must find a path that is an effective path to address what would be gaps in the regulatory oversight of this space. And I think that requires congressional action. And I think that there are a number of bills pending that present great ideas. I hope someone will quickly come and create some master spreadsheet and then use an algorithm to translate that into the most masterful legislation, use that GPT app to get it all written up. And then we'll be done, and that'll be great. And then I'll be back to having a cushy appointment and not what I've had for the last several months. Thank you for the question.
We've got time for one more. There's another question from the audience. Yes, do I see your hand up? You're like sheepish again, but like that, sister. All right, tell us your question.
First of all, thank you so much for speaking, for everyone for speaking. I think so much of what's been said has really kind of inform this overall kind of general question I have about how the crypto markets are both areas of opportunity for, it's high risk, but there's also high rewards that are potentially available. And I think that a lot of especially sovereign nations are seeing that as an alternative to maybe going to like the IMF and, getting money from there that come with a lot of limitations. But then on the other side of things, we also see that, things here that look like, FTX collapsing in a place like Kazakhstan, where like over $1 billion of money that Sam Bankman-Fried invested in like trying to have a whole Bitcoin mining operation, and like that, that taking a huge toll on Kazakhstan's electric grid, that, and of course, there are plenty of other geopolitical issues that lead to unrest in the country, but issues there, issues in El Salvador, where, they've made Bitcoin legal tender, but vast majority of El Salvadorians don't even use it. And I mean, the whole, like, I think that to me, the thing that really underlines what I see as an undercurrent of a problem is that announcement was made in Miami of Bitcoin is now one of El Salvador's legal tender, is made in Miami, not in El Salvador, which kind of to me goes to like show that there are a lot of interests that are based here in the United States that are investing in countries and oftentimes are based in other countries that don't have the same kinds of tools that we have to regulate them. And because of that, normal citizens of El Salvador or Kazakhstan are like having very serious issues as a result of that. And, I think that it's a huge complex problem. Obviously, not all of that can be solved by regulations here in the US, but I mean, obviously, crypto is not the only financial market that has taken advantage of average people. Like, let's just put that out there as well. But are there any sort of solutions that are available to regulators at the CFTC or at the SEC or whoever has oversight over this? Are there tools to kind of address these kinds of issues?
Yeah, so first I want to share that the last trip I took, literally a week before the pandemic, became a really apparent part of our lives and resulted in schools closing and businesses shuttering their doors for a long period of time, was 2 L's outdoor. So I deeply appreciate your comments there for so many different reasons. I think I'd also just say really quickly that there is a big issue here that we've not landed on in a very articulate way. And I want to offer just a sentence or two about it. And that is the extraterritorial implications of activities undertaken in the US, activities undertaken outside the US, the limitations on extraterritorial application of US law. All of this is very relevant in the conversation about how we coordinate or collaborate with international regulators. And I guess if we took a step back, what we would say is it's very important to ensure collaboration because markets are global, right? We know that we live in a country with preeminent financial markets, but these markets are not unaffected. They are not unaffected by things happening in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. Very specifically, to your point, geopolitical events in Ukraine and Russia, Russia's invasion of Ukraine really marks a significant moment of tension for the broader commodities markets. Most of you would be familiar with the reality that the invasion prompted sanctions, and the sanctions created really real tumult in energy markets, a market where Russia was a significant exporter of the commodity energy. But maybe fewer of you would know that wheat, which is one of the most significant exports for Ukraine and is one of the most quintessential ingredients in the food supply of the world, was also heavily impacted by those geopolitical events because the invasion halted the ability to harvest and distribute significant, massive amounts of wheat that would have been distributed all over the world from Ukraine. So we are not an island. That certainly is a fair observation. And in the context of what happens next for digital assets, we certainly want to have a seat at the table. We've regularly been a preeminent voice in helping to structure regulation and law, and I hope that that continues. Our goal in this moment, as is true probably for many regulators, is just to fully get our arms around the technology and understand the operational infrastructure, and how, to the earlier question, we are able to fit any of that into our existing regulation, and where the fit is in fact an ill fit, and therefore there's a need to take a different step or to layer on new protections. So I think you're right in having pointed all of that out. So thanks so much. I'll say one last thing, because I know Professor Morris is hoping that we will run. I am throwing the doors open wide and hoping that any of you who are interested in internships will let us know later. We have successfully brought on a few Emory Law students into my office. We would love to have that expand. And even if it's the case that we can't perfectly fit you into an internship program, we'd love to have you come and share some of your thinking and reading and maybe some of your research or work in this area. Thanks so much.
Yes, all right, on that note, I'm going to say, please congratulate Commissioner Johnson, our Benn Konsynski and Tiffany Smith and Nelson Rosario for joining us today. I kept you past 2 o'clock. I'm sorry. If you drove and need a parking validation, Tiara, waving in, we've got them in the back table. If you want to grab a box lunch, please free to do that as well. But thank you so much for joining us today. That concludes our Tiger Conference. Thank you.
Just hang out. Yeah, I know you got a hot mic situation going.